All right, guys. Well, thanks, Nikki, for the brief introduction. I am so excited about this opportunity. The gals and I were chatting before the meeting officially started, and so I think we're all on the same page, and I'm really looking forward to a fruitful conversation after these short presentations. So, like Nikki said, we're going to talk a little bit about the Guatemala Rabbit Project. This is really a passion of mine at this point, but I want to give you a little bit of a brief background on who I am. So, I currently serve as the Director of Academic Advising here in the College of Ag and Life Sciences at Mississippi State. I am originally from Alabama, grew up on a small commercial beef cattle operation. So I'm a country girl at heart. That is who I am for sure. Like many of our students here in the College of Ag, going in the Animal and Dairy Sciences program, I wanted to go to vet school and quickly changed my mind. I decided that that was not where my heart was, and so I continued working toward a production type degree, and then followed to do some research with ruminant nutrition. And then fast forward, I'm currently in the finishing stages of earning my doctoral degree in agricultural and extension education. And you see at the bottom of the screen, I'm working with Global Business Solutions Institute, which is a small nonprofit organization. So I have to just say this is not a paid gig. I am full-time employed by Mississippi State University, but I do work with GBSI as my schedule allows. I'm always excited to take my family to Guatemala. These were pictures taken in 2018. Our son Briar, he went with us. He was 6 at the time, and we now have a 2-year-old. So she's not been able to go yet, but it's definitely an international family affair when we start talking about getting some of these activities going. My husband's able to go. So, just a brief overview of my international outreach story. It all began in 2015. I had the opportunity to go to Grenada, which is a small island country down in the Caribbean. It was a really cool experience that I went on a work trip, and that immediately kind of, I say I caught the bug. I caught that international travel bug and wanted more. So that led me to do some work with Christian veterinary missions down in Haiti a couple of years. And so every year I feel like I've traveled somewhere in maybe different capacities. But my heart really kind of,
Okay, so the
someone
meeting
there.
is at 12:30.
So, so in 2017, that was when the first Guatemala livestock education program started. And briefly in that bio, you learn that it's a community engaged learning study abroad course for students. And so that was really the launch of that program here at Mississippi State. And it's really kind of evolved now. It's still called the Guatemala Livestock Education Program, but every year we do something a little bit different. Currently, our focus is on the rabbit project, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. All right, so right now we are focused in the Western Highlands area of Guatemala, and the photo on the left here, specifically, we work in the Department of Totonicapan. And there's really 3 larger municipalities that we work in. Momostenango is kind of our home base there when we stay there. Santa Maria Chicamula, Totonicapan, and San Cristobal are all locations where we work and have activities going on with the students and with GBSI. And this particular location was chosen because of the stunting rate. So here you see Sustainable Development Goals Fund has reported in 2017 that the stunting rates are over 80%. And that, in my mind, is not acceptable. And I think Jennie will probably agree with that. And maybe everyone here would agree with that. But it was really just a kind of a breathtaking thing for me that really motivated me to do more. So I started looking at ways that we could do more as a university, particularly with study abroad programming, to help combat some of these challenges. So livestock production in Guatemala is there. It's not non-existent, but the question always comes up of why rabbits. And so a lot of the families there you'll see raise poultry, and those are used for household consumption. And of the meat or the animal flesh, and also egg production from some of those laying hens. Larger livestock species like cattle and sheep and pigs and goats, they are there and they're being raised, but less common for meat consumption purposes by the household. A lot of those families we've seen that we work with, they may have a cow, for example, but that animal is simply there to generate some additional income. So they'll graze on the forages that they have available and then sell that animal, hopefully for a profit. And so when we started exploring and really looking at the rabbit as an option, we became it was very aware we became very aware that not a lot of families had rabbits, and if they did, they were mostly for pets. Rabbits are seen as a sign of fertility there, and so there was a little bit of taboo around it. Rabbit meat was not widely consumed at all, so we wanted to take on the challenge of introducing rabbits, and so far so good. So quickly, beef production comes in a lot of different shapes and forms. You can see here this black and white cow, this Holstein cow with a calf that doesn't really look like her next to her. So she's raising this little calf. The bull on the bottom right is, these are Brahman based or Bos Indicus based cattle. And a lot of them are raised down on the coastal areas and then brought up to like the highlands areas. They're harvested there. So I'm going to show you a quick picture. If you're a little bit squeamish, you might not want to look at this one. But the question is, how fresh is fresh? So one of the things that we do with students is we take them to the local market and we let them experience what beef production, that harvest process looks like, because it's very different there in this particular location and how we go about the process than what it is we do here in the States. And so many of the students that go on this particular trip have taken our meat science class here at Mississippi State, or know a little bit about what that process looks like. And so it's a really cool experience for them to see firsthand. Sheep and wool production specifically is something that you see. And that's really because we have a lot of outstanding craftsmanship. The artisans there, I'm blown away every time I meet one of these families. Just the artisanship and the craftsmanship of the products that they produce. So they spin their own wool, they and make yarn and create some of these products such as ponchos and rugs. These are a couple of rugs being made here. So it's really cool to see that, and of course for the students to experience. So like many of the countries that many of you probably work in, there's a rainy season and a dry season, and there's without a doubt there are implications on livestock production in this type of environment. And so one of the things that we're doing with the rabbit project is, even if it's a small livestock species, but we're looking at ways to utilize some of those forages and perhaps make hay and train the individuals how to make hay or preserve those forages so that they can be used in future the dry period perhaps. So that big question, why rabbits? People look at me all the time and go, Jessica, how on earth did you come about rabbit production for this? But here are a few reasons why. And to me, it makes common sense. It's just a good small livestock model that fits within the space that many of these families have access to, the resources in terms of nutritional resources that they have. Of course, we know that rabbits mature pretty quickly and they reproduce very quickly as well. There's even some things like what we call bunny honey. So using the output of those animals to produce an opportunity for vermiculture. Okay, so worm farming, vermiculture, and again, if you think about it from a sustainability lens, this is also something that would marry very well with poultry production. So those worms could be raised in an environment that would then serve as a food source or a nutrition source for some of the poultry products there. Rabbits also are a dual purpose animal in most every case where you can utilize the hide or the pelt of that animal. So the brain, we train the ladies how to use the brain of the animal and how to tan that hide, and then tan the hide and then turn that into a product that could be sold at the local market or potentially even exported. So there's a lot of fun things going on there. Okay, so quickly the timeline. So this all began, the Guatemala Rabbit Project all began in March of 2019. I was about 2 weeks from having a baby at that point. My husband was like, "You are not going to Guatemala." So I relied on the students. So a group of 9 students did the initial training in Guatemala. They trained 37 ladies in 3 different communities. Beyond that, we took a trip and did some follow up in March of 2020. I had 20 students in Guatemala in 2020 and barely got out about 48 hours before the global pandemic started hindering travel and that kind of thing. So at that point, we did some follow up, some troubleshooting with some of the families that had been trained the previous year. And again, the students, they are all hands on deck at this point. So they're able to utilize the training and the knowledge and the skills that they have in rabbit production or livestock production in general, and communicate that training or that education in country to some of those ladies. July of 2020, throughout the whole the duration of 2020, there was continued follow up. The GBSI staff in country were able to collect some data, and I told the gals earlier, there's not a lot of data in this particular presentation. We did have reports in 2019. Those families reported that they only consumed meat 1.2 times per week. So that pictographic that you see down there, if you said we had 21 meals, a meal 3 times a day, 7 days a week, only about one of those meals contained meat. Here are just a few pictures quickly. We train the ladies in how to properly harvest and stun those animals and harvest and process that carcass. We started exploring novel identification methods. So here is a picture of an ear notch of maybe to quickly tell which is male, which is female. I've mentioned the brain tanning technique that we also train them on. The team of students and my colleagues here, they always love being able to provide some hands-on training with these gals, the ladies in those communities. And so here they've built a hutch, some follow-up. So it's always nice to see some successful follow-up. So picture on the left here, we've got a doe that's got a litter of kits. And then in the other picture, I love the ingenuity of this particular hutch. So if you see the resources are limited, it was really exciting to see this because they're utilizing the back wall there to expand and give those rabbits a little bit more space, floor space, with the wire that they had available. We developed a community rabbitry. So this is a partnership in a community that we work with to hopefully move forward in some rabbit projects, looking at breed characteristics and things of that nature. We did go into a new community. The ladies there, they love the process and the idea of raising rabbits. And so here's just a few photos. We harvested an animal and they cooked that meat up. And the little kiddos around there, they were pretty anxious to get a piece of that meat as we ended our time there. So fast forward, this is 2021. GBSI has just recently hired a social integrator. Her name is Lucrecia. We call her Lukey. And she is working she lives and works in the community of Hutica. And so just in the last few months, more ladies have been trained now in how to raise rabbits. And just a couple of weeks ago, I took a trip to Guatemala with the GBSI leadership team, and we were able to provide some follow-up training and troubleshooting for those newly trained families doing harvest and hide tanning techniques. Here's just a couple of pictures of some follow-up, and you can see they have, right now it's the rainy season, they have access to some of those green resources that are suitable to feed the rabbits. So probably the most exciting thing that I can tell you right now is we went back to a family that was trained, or a community where several ladies were trained back in 2019. And so fast forward 2 years, those ladies that initially reported they were only eating meat 1.2 times per week in that family now reported that their meat consumption had gone up to 4 times per week. And I have chill bumps just talking about it, because that was the goal of this project, is to increase the animal protein consumption, or really the overall diversity in that diet. And so now they're able to consume other products, meat products, including rabbits, but poultry, of course. They commented on eating dried fish and more beef and things of that nature. So that is really encouraging to me. So at the end of the day, my passion and my goal is to work with these ladies in the Highlands to empower them, help reduce some of the poverty and alleviate some of those poverty stricken environments that we see, and ultimately increase that food security for women and children and those that truly need it most in the Highlands area. There's opportunities to get involved if you'd like to connect with me. I'm going to leave my content here, and I'm happy to share these slides if you want, but that is it. It's not a lot of science, but I look forward to hearing Jennie's presentation and for us to have a fruitful conversation here soon.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica. I really appreciate it. That was some really interesting stuff that you shared. And so I mentioned in the chat, we'll be holding questions until the very end, so after Jennie's presentation. But in the meantime, if there's something that you can think of, any burning questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So thanks again, Jessica. And Jennie, would you like to take it away?
Sounds good. Okay, let me share and share. Okay, thanks, Jessica. That was super interesting. And also I will have to talk about this later, but I had a project going in Haiti initially for my PhD, and there's a lot going on in Haiti, so that project was put on hold, but so we have some connection there. But hi, everybody. I'm excited to be here today and talk about, I'm going to be much more on the nutrition side of this than any agricultural side, but I'm a nutritionist by trade, and I'm a dietitian as well. And I'm currently in my hopefully final year of a PhD at the University of California at Davis, barring another pandemic. So we'll see how that goes. And then I have an emphasis at this Institute for Global Nutrition. And so while my PhD is going to be in nutritional biology, I'm getting this emphasis in global nutrition, which is essentially epidemiology with more of a public health focus. So I'm definitely looking at nutrition and nutrition impacts in global settings from a pretty high level. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of my definitions between, well, not mine, these are published definitions, but definitions between food security and nutrition security. And also just point out this publication that comes out every year, and especially for those of you that are involved in both nutrition and agriculture, the Food and Agriculture Association puts out this publication every year, and it's a really good summary of what's going on with the food security situation in the whole world. And they also do a really good job of integrating different insights from the ag industry and from all the different food systems in terms of how they're evaluating food security and also how we can address it. And so I recommend checking it out. If you're interested, it's free to download. And this, just when we're thinking about food security, oftentimes what we're thinking about is how to get food into people. So we want to just get calories there. So we're thinking about what food is available, what calories are available, can people access it, do they have money, do they have transportation, and then can their bodies utilize it? So are they sick, or they have some sort of condition that's preventing them from absorbing and metabolizing the nutrients? Do they have all their teeth? Can they chew the food? And so this is kind of all involved in food security. And then when we talk about nutrition security, we get onto the side of nutritious diet. So, okay, we've got all these calories, but how can we also make sure that they are nutrient dense, which I love about the Rabbit Project. And Jessica, that's very nutrient dense. So when I'm thinking about food insecurity, I'm often thinking more about nutrition insecurity, because I'm thinking about how can we get the most nutrition that's affordable and accessible to all people into an at-risk population. And we can think about this a little bit in terms of what was going on, or what's continuing to go on in this last year in the pandemic. So in the pandemic, there's an estimate, and it's from that publication I just showed, that about 1 in 3 people globally were experiencing food insecurity last year due to the impacts of the pandemic. And they're estimating, some modeling studies are estimating that up to 7 million children, maybe in addition to the normal stunting that we typically see around the globe, we may have an additional 7 million children impacted by stunting due to the effects of the pandemic, and up to 2.8 million children wasted. And I'm bringing those up because in the nutrition world, we use these indicators a lot of child stunting and child wasting to try and figure out where we are in our nutrition status. So when a child is wasted, that's when they're too skinny for their height. And it's usually it can be pretty quick, because if you don't have food, you're going to lose weight pretty darn fast, especially if you're a child. But a stunted child, that's when you're too short for your age. And that's a measure of length, right? And it takes a long time for us to grow. So if we're thinking about a stunted child, we're definitely often thinking about what happened at some period in their life or over the course of a long time where they couldn't get enough nutrients to actually be able to grow properly. And there's a ton of factors that go into stunting. It's not just nutrition, but if we're just thinking about the nutrition side of it. So those are kind of two indicators that were coming out about how what we saw last year during the pandemic is an indication that, one, people didn't have enough food in a lot of populations. Two, they're not accessing nutrient-dense food. So the food that was available, oftentimes what may have had calories, but it may not have had nutrients. And so that brings me a little bit more into where I am with my research. And so we can kind of think about this a little bit more broadly in terms of what share of the global population can't afford a healthy diet. So not just calories, but actually nutrients. And this is 2017, but I imagine these countries just got a little bit darker in 2020. And so you can see that most of the food insecurity and the ability to afford a healthy diet, to not be able to afford one, is centered in the African continent and in Southeast Asia. And when we think about it, the World Bank poverty line has us at $1.90 a day to be able to afford our basic needs, which isn't very much money. But, and these are numbers coming from that publication I showed, currently in 2020, to be able to afford a healthy diet, so a diverse diet with access to various nutrients in the proportions that will actually allow a person to grow properly, in Africa, that number is at $4.37 a day, which is really expensive. And then you can see why the majority of that continent is dark red, because they can't afford that. In Southeast Asia, it's $4.13. This is, obviously there's a lot of variation on the entire continent, but South America, Central America, we're at $4.25 a day. And in the States, North America, and Europe, it's $3.43 a day. And that number is primarily lower because of our ability to transport food, and we have infrastructure, and we have a lot of systems in place to actually get food to people, even though we're still experiencing food insecurity in the US. So this brings me to where I've been sitting kind of with my research the last couple of years, thinking about this overlap of how people are getting calories, but they're not getting nutrient-dense foods. And we talk about this in terms of the double burden of malnutrition, where really it's actually a multi-burden, because you can have more than one form of malnutrition at the same time. So this double burden is described as having some sort of undernutrition, which might be a micronutrient deficiency, iron deficiency, or something else. And then anemia or stunting or wasting or underweight can all be indicators of undernutrition. And then they're overlapping with an indicator of overnutrition. So overweight, obesity, chronic disease, so maybe heart disease or diabetes or cancer. And you can have these things in a single person. So maybe some iron deficiency and stunting within one child who may also be overweight. You can have it in a household where a mom might be overweight and her child is stunted, or in a population, which is typically where we end up measuring it, where you have some proportion of the population that's stunted and some proportion of the population that is overweight or obese. And so these give us an idea of, okay, we're getting food to people, but we're not actually getting nutrients to people. So how can we assess that a little bit better, and what can we do to improve these systems? And this is just another example of kind of how we can look at the overlap. We see, for example, in the map on the right, or on the left over here, most of the stunting is centered in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and most of our overweight and obesity is in our high-income countries. However, in Africa and Southeast Asia, overweight and obesity is still at 20 to 30%. And this is in 2016. So even though you have a lot of stunting among children, you still have 20 to 30% of the adult population that's experiencing overweight and obesity. So that is an example of this overlap of multiple burdens of malnutrition, particularly at the population level. So one of the ways that I've been looking at this is through this group called the Brenda Project, and they are out of Emory University, and it's a number of different researchers and experts in the field, and I just came on this last year, and it's been in place for a while. But they essentially have been looking at how can we better assess micronutrient deficiencies in global settings, and what are we not doing that's allowing us to have inaccurate assessment. And so one thing they were thinking about is, well, inflammation is present, especially when we're sick, and especially it's present in particular areas that have malaria or really high risk of diarrhea or different things like that. There's a lot of inflammation in the bodies. And as we have discovered through nutrition metabolism, this impacts how various micronutrients are absorbed and retained in our bodies. So they looked at how we can better assess micronutrient status, taking into account inflammation, so we have a better idea of what's going on in the world. And they did this by looking at a lot of secondary data, taking a lot of surveys. Right now we're looking at about 30 surveys, a huge amount of observations, and taking a look at women and children and trying to improve their assessment of iron status, vitamin A status, zinc, B12, all these different, and anemia, through the relationship with inflammation, and determining that, yes, it's pretty important to take inflammation into account, and we can get better estimates of a population's nutrition status by doing that. So in my piece of that, I thought, okay, so why we know that there's inflammation present in a population that has anemia or micronutrient deficiencies, but we also know that populations that are experiencing overweight and obesity have this low-grade systemic inflammation. So is this also impacting their micronutrient status, and how much? And do we need to also be looking at that? So from this super high level of lots and lots of surveys, secondary data, I'm taking a look at the differences in weight status, particularly among overweight and obese populations, and that relationship between inflammation and micronutrient status. And so we can see if someone who is experiencing overweight and obesity is also experiencing iron deficiency, how much of that might not be being measured accurately because of their inflammation. And this is important when we're thinking about food security in a world where it's present in a lot of different situations, because when we're accessing these foods that are not high in nutrients, we know that they may be providing calories, and so we may be able to gain weight, and we may actually look normally nourished, but if we were to actually measure our micronutrient status, we might not be properly nourished. And so this is another way of just kind of assessing the reality of that situation. And as Jessica was saying, I'm kind of in the middle of my analysis, so I can't share results at this point, but the papers should be coming out, well, probably next year if I'm being reasonable. But if we think about kind of impacts on food insecurity and health outcomes, again, we're looking at how to improve assessment of micronutrient status in populations that we may be missing. And this is really important for intervening at the nutrition level or at a food systems level, and for prioritizing these high-risk groups, which very often overlap with the same groups of people that are experiencing food insecurity. And then it's potentially an increasing problem because overweight and obesity is increasing throughout the world. So we really need to make sure that we're properly assessing the various populations. So that's one way of looking at food insecurity indirectly, but through nutrition assessment. And then the second project I'm working on, we call it the COMET project. And so this is the Condiment Micronutrient Innovation Trial, and it's in collaboration with the University of Ghana and with funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Helen Keller International. And this is through my group at UC Davis. And we are fortifying, and I am definitely a grad student on this. When I say we, it's definitely the people far above me, but we are fortifying bouillon cubes to determine whether or not a fortified bouillon cube can improve micronutrient status. So with this trial, we're taking a look at the overall nutrition status of an entire population, recognizing that there are inadequacies in terms of micronutrients and their ability to access food that is nutrient dense, and thinking about what foods they're already eating that are already present in their diets that they're already able to afford, and how can we make those foods more nutrient dense. And this is very much large scale food fortification, which is a popular topic in global nutrition right now, as a potential way to impact a large number of people and potentially improve nutrition status. So with our cubes, we will do this trial, which hopefully will be taking place later this year and next year. We've done a lot of formative work, but we'll start the trial in a few months. And we'll fortify our cubes with folic acid, iron, vitamin A, and vitamin B12, zinc, and then iodized salt. And we'll compare it to a group that's taking the control cubes, which just have the iodized salt. And we'll do this over the course of 9 months among a couple of target groups, and then we'll see. Fingers crossed that something happens that's positive. And we chose this area in Ghana, one, because of our collaborations and our strong collaborators there, and two, because this area, we're going to be up in northern Ghana. There's already a known high prevalence of micronutrient deficiencies. There's a high level of poverty and food insecurity. There's not many other fortified foods on the market, and so they're not getting a lot of micronutrients from other fortified foods. And bouillon is used ubiquitously. It's in all the dishes, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, multiple times a day. And so it's something that this population it's a cornerstone of their diet. So the potential of this project to impact food insecurity is basically trying to make these foods that are already being eaten by this population more nutrient dense, without forcing people to change their habits, because we know that's very hard. And then also not expecting them to pay for something that they can't afford just because they're told that it's better for them, because that also is really hard to do when you're already not accessing the amount of food that you need. And then this is also great because it's a collaboration with the Ghanaian government to produce and promote these bouillon cubes within their own country, which ideally will then feed back into a system of improving access to nutrient-dense foods. And in terms of health outcomes, as the nutrition side, we're hoping to improve micronutrient status in the short term. And then over the long term, we can potentially be improving child growth and cognition, or improve maternal pregnancy and birth outcomes. All of these are related to improving micronutrient status, either when children are young or when they're in utero or when they're still growing inside their moms, because that will most likely impact their health and nutrition status for the rest of their life. So those are my 2 projects, kind of a quick overview, but that's it. And I'm happy to talk about everything with Jessica and the rest of the group, and also contact info if there's any specific questions on my work. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny. I appreciate it. And
yeah,
we've had a few questions about whether or not the recording will be available. So yes, we are recording this, and we'll be sending out a link to the recordings later on. So if you want to share with people, or if you want to rewatch portions, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, so now let's dive into the question and answer session. We've got a couple questions already. The first question is for Jessica. It's from Douglas Steinberg from NCBA CLUSA, and says, for rabbits, are there cultural or other barriers to consuming them? For example, if they are viewed as pets, people might be reticent to eat them.
Thanks for the question, Douglas. I mentioned it briefly, but rabbit meat was not widely consumed in the areas where we worked. And when we found rabbits, most of the individuals or families had them as pets. And so, as you might imagine, there are some barriers to adopting or accepting a new meat or this change in one's diet. And Jennie even alluded to this, like making change in one's diet is very hard. One of the ways that we have found to maybe increase the acceptance of consuming rabbit meat is to really share a meal. So our students did farm to fork training. So we train them on the production aspect of how to raise the rabbits and how to care for them properly, but then also the post-harvest process. So to harvest that animal, to process the meat. And so they would say, well, how do we cook this? We've harvested this animal now, like, what do we do with it? And the simple answer is cook it like you would cook poultry. It's a white meat. In many cases, it's very nutrient dense, it's low in cholesterol, high in protein. And so the families would, the ladies of those communities would take a rabbit or two, or however many were harvested that day, and we would ultimately share a meal. And so to me, food is a centerpiece in many of our cultures, and I think it brings people together. And so we would actually sit down and share a meal, and the adoption rates, because of that shared experience, I believe were very positively contributed to the adoption of the Rabbit Project overall, because they like the meat after trying it. So that was our approach, but short and sweet, yes, there are definitely some cultural barriers that would have to be overcome to increase that adoption.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. The next question is also from Douglas, and it's for Jennie. And he asks if you can explain how you measure inflammation.
Yeah, well, so in this case, with the surveys that were done that we're using two proteins. We're using the C-reactive protein and the alpha-1 glycoprotein. And so in survey settings, it's more typical over the last couple of decades. If you measured inflammation, you would measure it with CRP, or the C-reactive protein. It's becoming a little bit more common to also measure AGP, or the alpha-1 glycoprotein. But those are the two that we're measuring, and it's because they're easy to analyze. You can analyze them with an ELISA kit, and so they're relatively inexpensive as far as analysis. There's certainly many better ways, or multiple ways, to get a clearer picture of inflammation, but that's the easiest thing to access.
Great, thanks, Jennie. Okay, the next question is from John, and it's for Jessica. Were local institutions, including the Ministry of Agriculture, involved, and what are the opportunities to replicate and scale this project?
That's a question that we get frequently as well. So we're not involved with any other institutions, so universities in Guatemala at this point. The Global Business Solutions Institute organization, however, does have very strong relationships with MAGA, the Ministry of Agriculture. So just actually last week while we were there, we went to visit some places where MAGA does a lot of continued work with the established greenhouses that GBSI has put in. So we do have a strong relationship with MAGA. To replicate and maybe scale up this project, I'm on board. We don't have specific plans for that yet, because it's one step at a time. We do have some restrictions in where we can work when I take students, particularly because of just travel restrictions in some of the communities for risk. And so we have chosen so far to specifically stay in Totonicapán. To that end, Quetzaltenango, the neighboring state in Guatemala, there's a large population. It's a very highly populated, very urban location in that area. So we may work there in the future. I don't know if Mississippi State will directly be involved, or maybe GBSI would take the lead on that. But yes, we definitely want to scale up and do more of the Rabbit Project.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. Okay, John has a question for Jennie. So it's a three-part question. So if you want me to go one at a time, should I do that?
That's okay. I've got it in the chat too,
okay,
so I
perfect.
can also follow.
Okay, so yeah, if you want to go ahead and read the questions and then answer them as you go.
Yeah, and John, these are great questions. So yeah, he asked, were other widely consumed foods considered other than bouillon? And then what data shows the ubiquitous consumption? So those two kind of go together, and what has been done previously is some formative work, mostly with food balance sheets and food and household food consumption surveys, to take a look and see what foods are being most widely consumed in West Africa. And so this project, we're doing our trial in Ghana, but we're doing this project includes Nigeria, Senegal, Burkina Faso, and Niger, I believe, Niger. And so I might be wrong on that last one. I can't remember the last country. But we are looking at food consumption among all of these different countries, and what foods are most widely consumed, which ones are potentially fortifiable that are not already fortified. So a lot of these countries are already fortifying things like palm oil with vitamin A. If wheat flour is widely consumed, they might be already fortifying wheat flour. Salt is obviously, in most of these countries, already iodized. There's some talk about doing some doubly fortified salt, but I think those trials are being done in Ethiopia and in Kenya at the moment. And so we've been taking a look at data that's already available, so you can see what people are consuming and how much, doing some modeling to see if we can impact nutrition status by fortifying this bouillon cube on top of what already might be available on the market. And then in terms of how do we know it's so widely consumed, some of that work was done prior to me coming on the study, but part of our formative work has been to go into this area and make sure that we were right about the bouillon consumption. And we've already completed the pilot work. So we've already gone through and assessed bouillon consumption and measured it and tallied it and recognized that our measurements are pretty much right, that people tend to consume about 2.5 grams of bouillon a day. It's about 2 grams for children and about 2.5 grams for adult women and adult males per day in this region. And then that's also pretty much the same for the entirety of Ghana, and it changes a little bit country by country. So it's been a long process of formative work already, a couple of years of that. And then, yeah, and so the cost implications and strategy for private sector engagement. Yeah, so half of our team is coming from the economic sector, and I can put a link in here, this group called MiniMod, which is out of UC Davis, and they do a lot of cost effectiveness modeling specifically on food fortification. Like, how can we scale up food fortification in a cost effective manner, and what's going to make sense? And so we've been doing a lot of that modeling over the past couple of years. And that information will be coming out pretty soon. The papers are getting written up right now. But basically, bouillon ended up being one of the more cost-effective food items to fortify because it's not very expensive to produce. The tricky part is getting enough micronutrients in it to actually impact nutrition status and not make it too expensive and not make it taste bad. And so we're figuring that part out right now with some acceptability trials. And then these bouillon cubes will be, the talks are in process with the private sector, but eventually they will be produced in country alongside the government, which would put out a mandate that all bouillon cubes have to be fortified with such and such ingredients and such levels. And there's a number of bouillon industries within Ghana that we're working with to be able to make sure that they can scale up to do that if this actually goes forward.
Great, thanks, Jenny. All right, any other questions? You're welcome to either unmute and ask or post questions in the chat. And maybe while everyone's thinking, I have a question for Jessica. I was just curious, and you might have touched on this a little bit, but was there a reason for focusing specifically on female producers or female heads of house rather than the men?
Yes, and so many of us know that the females are responsible for household, they're preparing the meals, they're shopping, you know, they go to market several times a day to select foods. So females do a lot in the households, at least in Guatemala, and we know that, you know, really globally, that females are a cornerstone to what nutrition looks like in that household. And maybe Jenny, you have a little bit more solid data and you could speak to this a little bit more clearly, but we chose the females just because they've expressed an interest. We know that they have a large responsibility for handling nutrition at the household level. And many, quite frankly, many of the men are not present. You know, they may work in the city or they're away for the day at the very least. And so this allows us to work with that population, and they're there, they're at the home, and so they're caring for those livestock, maybe that they already have, chickens or small ruminants, that kind of thing. But Jenny, I don't know if you have any more to add to breathe into that response.
Is I muted? No, and I was just reading, I apologize, I was just reading a comment on the on the chat, so I missed some of what you said as well. So I don't, I'm sorry. But I was gonna ask also, Jessica, since I've got my mic off and thinking about the nutrition, I know you were talking about that you're trying to figure out whether or not you can scale up, but I was wondering how long this project is going to go from what you know of right now. And if you are, I know you're going to measure how much meat is being consumed and if that's been increasing, which looks like it is, which is great. But if you're also doing any other nutrition or anthropometric measurements to try and track some of that stuff too.
That's an awesome question. The short answer is my project, so part of my PhD project here is really about the adoption of the rabbit as an innovation to combat food security issues. So we also are doing some evaluation, mostly evaluation data collection at this point, about the project itself. So some process evaluation on how we are delivering that content, what the content is, making sure that it's developed in a way that's appropriate for the culture. And so we need to kind of settle on what that education piece looks like first. Many of the families, I shouldn't say most, many of the families have high rates of illiteracy as well. And so when you think about how to spread that education or disseminate that education with the adult populations, we have taken an approach to make a very picture heavy, like a graphic heavy type of publication at this point. And again, this is all pilot work. It's nothing's out in the World Wide Web yet, available at the large scale, but hopefully we will continue to take what is working and continue to improve upon that, and then scale it up. So it's just at the very infancy stage, if you will, of trying to get the rabbit project up off the ground. And of course, I would love to take this to other countries. Rabbits are not a novel innovation though. Ghana, lots of African countries use the rabbit as a model. So it's a more novel to Guatemala, but globally it's not a novel innovation or food source. But accessibility, you've mentioned that, allowing using the small livestock species as a mechanism to provide families access, because they have beef, they have pork, they have those types of foods, but no different than it is here in the States in poverty-stricken environments. That access is limited because of the financial resources and those socioeconomic status. I mean, there's so many moving parts to this, but this was a way to provide a family with a nutrient-dense resource that could be used for household consumption and to sell to generate income. And that's what we're seeing in most of those families. Some are selling them completely, some are only eating them, you know, they're using it for household consumption, and some are doing both. And so we're in the process of filtering through that data and trying to figure out what's next, like what's the next step. But I would love to collaborate in the future if you have some ideas.
Yeah, definitely. As we were discussing before, collaboration is hugely important.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, and I do have one more question for Jenny, and this is from Benedict Shishi from Nigeria. And he asks, in my society, most of the foods we consume are carbohydrate related. This is because it's what the people can find easily with limited resources. What, in your opinion, do you think people can do so that this doesn't negatively affect their health? And this could play into Jessica's research as well.
Yeah, well, and that's a good question. So So one thing, for example, with this bouillon project, one thing that we're thinking really critically about is whether or not we are going to be negatively impacting sodium consumption. Because obviously, I think about 25 to 45% of a bouillon cube is salt. And so that's actually, so even though I'm working on this comment project, my chapter of the dissertation is on salt and sodium consumption. So I'll be looking at that pretty heavily. I don't have any answers for you quite yet, but it's something that our stakeholders are really worried about by promoting bouillon. And the hypertension is actually, it's really high throughout almost all of sub-Saharan Africa. And it's really, I mean, heart disease is still the biggest killer in the United States, but what happens in like high income countries is that we have access to some treatments, even though there's still a lot of blood pressure out there, a lot of it's being controlled. And in areas that don't have access to treatment, you have uncontrolled hypertension, which is what's happening a lot in Ghana in particular. I haven't looked at many other countries, but we're going to look at that pretty heavily. And there's a lot of talk within the public health sector of the Ghanaian Ministry of Health to put out a lot of messaging about, okay, so bouillon might be okay to be, it hopefully will be fine to be consuming, and it's hopefully going to be healthier for you, but then you also need to consider putting less additional salt into your dishes, so that we're trying to promote this idea of not inducing any harm. But it's a really important question, and we're gathering information about it in order to have a better response. So I don't have a clear picture about that, but the idea being that by fortifying this food item that people are consuming regularly, hopefully we can, from coming in at a side angle, just improve diets without actually having to change behavior. And when you mentioned like a carbohydrate heavy diet, again, just looking at it from a food fortification standpoint, that's one of the reasons why some countries, for example, that are heavily reliant on bread or wheat flour products have been fortifying wheat. It's harder in countries such as Nigeria or Ghana, where some of the staple carbohydrates are not fortifiable. So it might be cassava or yams, or what I think cassava is one of the main ones in Ghana. So it's hard to fortify those foods. And so you kind of have to fortify or try and improve the foods that they're eaten with if they're being consumed with other foods, which is one of the reasons why we thought about bouillon, because a lot of these foods go into soups and stews. So it's a big process, and it's certainly one, I think that question is really poignant, and that it really points to that one thing isn't going to fix it, that you really have to come at it from a lot of different angles. Oh, and thank you for your comment. There's at least one Ghanaian in the audience. I appreciate that. Working hard, and I'm learning a lot.
Great. Thanks so much, Jessica and Jenny. So that's pretty much all we've got time for, but I know both Jessica and Jenny provided their contact information at the end of their PowerPoints. So we'll be sending out an email to everybody with the link to both the recording, and then if that's all right with you, Jessica and Jenny, I'll just include your email addresses in the body of the email as well.
Perfect.
So if anyone has any further questions or wants to reach out and collaborate, you can do so. But again, thank you so much to you both for taking the time to present, and thanks very much everyone else for attending. And yeah, this was really interesting. I learned a lot, so thank you so much.
All right, thanks everybody. This was fun.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
All right, thanks everyone. Take
Bye.
care.